Okay, so let me welcome our today's speaker, Mr. Kristian Hengster-Movric. His talk will be on models of disagreement and polarization on social networks.
Thank you for the introduction. I thank you all for the invitation to participate in today's seminar. It came as a surprise to me. I received an email when I was on the Arctic, and I had to figure out what to tell you. We have some friends in common. So let me just tell you a little bit about my background before we delve into the topic. I work in controls, in particular in controls of distributed controls of multi-agent systems, where we try to get entities, be they robots or some sort of machines, subsystems, to communicate together in a distributed way, modeled by a graph, to reach a consensus or synchronization of their states. That is the canonical control problem that we are solving. I did my PhD in the US when that was still a very much hot topic, dealing both with systems in discrete time and continuous time. Interesting story happened in 2016. I was at the CDC Control and Decision Conference, one of the largest conferences in the field, and there was a dedicated workshop about social networks, which was organized by Anton Proskurnikov. He is one of the people who rekindled the recent interest in the topic. I was surprised, just to share an anecdote with you, I was surprised to hear that back in 2016, China was very much interested in investing into research that dealt with constant polarization of opinions in societies. And at that point, I was really curious to learn why this is the case, because I could not foresee any reason why anyone, any society, polity would do it to themselves. Come 2018, and I was no longer surprised, because it seems that this has been an effort going on for a while, the targeted effort to polarize opinions in societies. The reason why I got so interested in the topic is that all of the things that have been done for distributed control of multi-agent systems have their analogs, have their parallels in the models of opinion evolution, opinion dynamics, opinion dissemination in social networks. The graph is the same. So the underlying mathematical theory is the same as the theory of graphs, and you have in the nodes of those graphs, you have dynamical systems that react to information they receive from their peers. But sociological problem is much older. The distributed control only happened when the miniaturization of control electronics and computation power made it available for, let's say, a formation of mobile robots to communicate with each other and make certain decisions on their own. People have been doing that for centuries. In particular, I have here some interesting papers that I will share with you later, and I will be more than open for discussion. A paper by Friedkin, one of the people whose model we are going to discuss. It's a beautiful survey paper that brings a sociological perspective. After the hierarchical mechanisms of social control, monarchy and the church were dismantled following the French Republican Revolution, the societies were faced with a challenge of how to coordinate their activities when you have a society of peers rather than a society of superiors and the underlings. So that is where distribution comes in. Distribution is connected to a shallow hierarchy. When all of us are equal, then everyone's opinion is equally valid and potentially equally influential. And although consensus, or rather agreement of a society behind a set of goals, a set of objectives, is what all societies should strive for, Emil Durkheim actually noticed that it is the presence of permanent disagreements in society that marks human social interactions and human social systems. So the first question is, how do we get a disagreement in a society when so many mathematical models that have been proposed lead to overall consensus? I would first like to introduce the French-Harray-deGroot model from the 1950s that was the first of such kind. By the way, graphs in social networks, the use of graphs to describe societies comes from the 1930s. Graph theory has been throughout the history of mathematics, graphs have been mostly used as some doodles, as some drawings to aid mathematical calculation. It's only in the 1920s and 1930s that graphs are starting to be studied in their own right. So already at the beginning, when graphs were still a new thing, Jacob Moreno introduced the application of graphs to sociology. He called them sociograms, and the nascent science was sociometry. But the first quantitative dynamical model was posited in discrete time, and it was from 1956 by French-Harray-deGroot. This is a discrete time, simple discrete time evolution, discrete time evolution system with a matrix W. And what is important about this matrix is that it is row stochastic and non-negative. This is standard for discrete time consensus, by the way, and there are specific ways in which we build such a matrix for multi-agent systems of robots. What happens here is each agent in question, each individual in question is making a convex combination. Remember, row stochastic matrix means that row sums equal to 1. So each individual is making a convex combination of opinions of its peers. The mental image I want you to have in your mind is opinion on just one topic, opinion on just one subject, and the people in the society have their own opinions. Those opinions are quantified. They can be positive or negative. They are simply real numbers. The structure of interpersonal influences is important for arriving at a conclusion what the final decision is going to be, how the society is going to agree or disagree on that particular topic. So when you evolve this type of a system, it depends primarily on the graph topology, on what type of sparsity you have in the W matrix, the outcome of the algorithm, the outcome, the final state. So again, this is essentially just the weighted adjacency matrix. I trust all of you are familiar with graph theory, right? So, okay, this is basically the weighted adjacency matrix. You can have different edge weights, but it is important that it is row stochastic. If your graph has a spanning tree, or if it is strongly connected, it is a more restrictive condition on the graph topology, you will have in fact that all of these opinions will reach consensus. They're all going to agree. All of the actors in the society are going to have the same opinion on the topic in question. It's not a problem to generalize this for a set of opinions, as long as opinions on a set of topics, as long as those opinions are independent of each other. You're basically running consensus algorithms on each single opinion. Each actor in a society takes in information from his peers, from his neighbors with a positive edge weight, adds them together and makes an average. That way, if you have a spanning tree in the graph structure of interpersonal relationships, the entire society is going to agree. At the end, they're going to have the same opinion on the topic in question. So where does the disagreement come from? Different from cooperative control, where that would be our goal, to have all robots agree on something of importance for their functionality. If in fact you have stubborn individuals, those who have the diagonal term in the W matrix equal to 1, they are not going to listen to any of their peers. They're simply going to retain their own opinion. And the existence of such stubborn individuals, if there are more than one, will imply that the graph has a spanning forest rather than a spanning tree. So those stubborn individuals, those leaders, let's call them that, are going to span the network depending on their opinion. They're going to retain their own opinion, and the rest of the network is going to range in opinions from one to the other. Or if they are completely disconnected, each one is going to draw to himself the entire tree of which itself is the root. So this is the simplest model of such dynamics. There are extensive papers, there are papers publishing extensive simulations done just using this simple model, where the connections are stochastic or averaged, or come from a distribution of relationships throughout different aspects or segments of an individual life. So there is a lot of ways you can make this more complicated, but essentially what you have is a convex combination algorithm that, in case of there being a spanning tree in a graph, which means a single leader or a strongly connected graph, will lead to consensus, or if you have a spanning forest, it will lead to a difference of opinions in the final state, which is going to be constant and irreconcilable. For those of you with more of an electrical engineering background, how many of you are electrical engineers here? Okay, none. Lovely, lovely. Okay, so I'm going to forgo the example, but you remember from college or high school, if you have a resistive network and you put different voltages on each end of a resistive network, you're going to have a voltage divider. The same thing happens with opinions in this situation. Two leaders actually act as two separate sources of different voltage, and you have a division of voltage from one to the other. Okay, that's an electrical engineering issue. But what is interesting about this model and what might not psychologically agree with how actual people think is that original opinions are lost in face of what comes from the peers. So you take your own opinion at equal weight, at equal value to the opinion of your peers. You just make the average, and your opinion, your friend's opinion, it doesn't matter. You don't retain your own opinions. That is why a lot of time has passed, but in 1990, Friedkin and Johnsen, following the psychological experiments with group psychology that they had done, proposed a different model where an individual in question is making yet another convex combination, except now it is a convex combination of the influences from the network, just the same that you had in French-Harray-deGroot model, and the original opinion of the individual in question. So this class of models interpolates between the pure French-Harray-deGroot model, which you would have with lambda I would be 1 for all i's, in which case this would be 0, and you would forget, everyone would forget their initial opinion as if it weren't there. And the other extreme, where you have lambda equal to 0, which boils down essentially to the stubborn individual. So you can model a stubborn individual who does not change his or her opinion regardless of what happens, either by having Wii equal to 1, W is still a row stochastic matrix, the weighted adjacency matrix of the graph, or you could have lambda equal to 0, which would essentially impose that for all subsequent times, his opinion on a topic or a set of topics remains the same. So this is interesting, and there is a nice induction proof of how this works and why does it work. But the important thing is that these lambdas are called susceptibilities, and they try to model how likely an individual is to listen to their peers, his or her peers, and adjust his or her opinion. Both in cooperative control, that's why the term is cooperative, and in these models, the assumption is that individuals undergo voluntary adjustments of opinions based on communication with their peers. In robots, they need to voluntarily exchange their states. So it's interesting that the Friedkin-Johnsen model preserves consensus, and if the society, if the graph is initially in consensus, then regardless of the value of lambda, you are going to have that the system remains in consensus. So the susceptibilities, diagonal matrix of susceptibilities, modifies this protocol, this algorithm. I tend to speak more in terms of controls, in such a way that the outcome is a more complicated function of the initial state. The outcome is still going to depend on the initial state, but that dependence is given through this V matrix, which is also row stochastic. So the final values of the evolution are going to be given by this expression here, and that allows you to, so there will be convex combinations of initial opinions. They allow you to identify something called Friedkin centralities. Using this matrix, which tells you how the final state depends on the initial opinions, as if this were just a one-step evolution from beginning until the end, allows you to see the influence each individual exerts in this dynamics, in the dynamical evolution of opinions. I would remind you that when talking about adjacency matrices, the way they are defined here, the way we usually define them, is that your neighbors are in the rows, your in neighbors are in the rows, your out neighbors are in the columns. So graphs are usually assumed to be directed, not necessarily undirected, not necessarily bidirectional. So in the convention that we have, and that convention might differ from author to author, depending on whether or not influence or receiving information is more important to you. Columns in this definition, columns tell you whom you influence, and rows tell you where you get your influence from. So the vector of Friedkin centralities is actually the normalized column sum. So it is the total sum of whom that agent in question influences, how his initial opinion translates into the final opinion distribution of the entire network. Likewise, many complications have been done on this model in a sense that graphs are taken not to be fixed and given, rather stochastic graphs, and then you're doing statistical analysis and you're looking at distributions of elements in the adjacency matrix characterizing interpersonal influences. Those are all complications. The outcome is described by these simple few equations, and then you can study really the influence of each individual in a society, how his or her initial opinion affects the distribution of opinions in the network. The reason why these models are so simple, let me just take a pause here. We've just discussed two classes of models, the French-Harray-deGroot model that was simple convex combination, and this Friedkin-Johnsen model that remembers the initial opinion. They are both based on convex combinations, and those, in the opinion of psychologists who introduced them, social psychologists, correspond to a coarse description of how group psychology works. There were psychological experiments where people came with their initial opinions, then they had a 15-minute discussion, then they recorded their changed opinions, and the experimenters who conducted those experiments concluded that the final opinions are in the convex set of the initial opinions, and there is a tendency for individuals to remember their initial opinions. One compelling way of how this can be made more realistic is by doing asynchronous or gossip algorithms on the Friedkin-Johnsen model. How many of you are familiar with gossip algorithms? Okay, so fascinating thing happens in distributed protocols over networks. What I've just told you before, the graph having a spanning tree or being strongly connected, the assumption was that the graph is constant throughout the interaction. But in discrete time, more easily than in continuous time. In continuous time, it also holds, but it's more complicated to show it. You do not need to have this topology condition imposed on the graph all the time if the graph switches. Rather, the union graph over time needs to satisfy the connectivity condition. So, okay, that's a mathematical statement of it. Basically, it means if the union graph is strongly connected, or if the union graph contains a spanning tree, then the product of the matrices that change in time is going to induce a graph that contains the union graph as a subgraph. So that's switching graphs. The motivation for considering switching graphs comes in a way to simplify analysis of actual multi-robot systems, because if you have robots in this room walking around, the topology of their interaction changes based on their position. If you were to model that, that would be a complicated nonlinear system, very difficult to analyze. So you rather assume that you have random switching in time of the graph topology, and you have evolution over piecewise constant graphs, or your graphs can switch at discrete time steps. So that weakens the conditions on the graph topology that you need to have so that you reach consensus. Speaking of consensus or disagreement, similar idea. Why is this so important? Because both practically and realistically, if you have a finite time horizon over which the union graph satisfies the connectivity properties, you are guaranteed to reach consensus or a certain distribution of opinions. That means that at each time, at each individual time segment, you can have only one edge in a graph and all other edges removed. And if you have one edge between enough agents, often enough, you are going to run your evolution as if you had a connected graph. Those are gossip algorithms, called like that because when two people meet at a water cooler, they gossip. Gossip is always done pairwise, not in a wider group. So if you have a bunch of people in an office and they pairwise gossip over breaks, how many breaks they take in their day, each time in the interaction graph, you have just a single edge. However, if you have edges between enough agents infinitely often, you are going to have the union graph actually satisfies the required connectivity properties. And that is actually what happens in societies. When people talk over the phone, they exchange opinions. They are just two people engaged in communication, which is modeled by a single edge in a graph. So again, the gossip algorithms are very compelling because you can have robots underground where they cannot communicate all together. They can only communicate when you meet. There was a DARPA subterranean challenge, which people at my college were very interested in. They were quite good at. So robots exchange information when they meet, and they manage to explore a subterranean system of caves. Whatever tunnels. In a society, you have individuals talking at each time just pairwise, and they can reach the same outcome as if the graph had connectivity properties from the start. In a case where you have random switching, it's really difficult to connect the initial state to the final outcome. So what people do is they usually just simulate this and look at statistical analysis, so you have certain distribution of switching moments. What I find more compelling, so this is one way of making this more realistic and more interesting. You see, there is just an evolution opinion update over one edge, and all of them remain the same, and then you switch the edges. Hexagon-Krauss model is also interesting. However, that's notoriously difficult to analyze and people just simulate it. It is when your edges in the adjacency matrix depend on your opinion. There's some nonlinear function of opinion. So if you have opinions which are too different, you're not going to have an edge. You're not going to talk to someone with whom you completely disagree. The problem with that model, as realistic as it may be, and it brings fascinating richness of dynamics, the problem is that this model is very difficult to analyze due to nonlinearity in the dependence of edges on the states. That's the same problem that people encountered when they try to analyze a system of robots who communicate based on their proximity, and their positions depend on their state of motion. So you have a graph that depends in a very complicated way. Edge weights depend in a very complicated way on the states of the agents, and states of the agents are outcome of an evolution that proceeds through the graph topology. So that's a mess to analyze if you think about dynamical systems. The part that I find quite compelling is the attempt to delve deeper beyond just the convex combination of opinions from peers and your initial opinion into the internal mental space of individuals in question. So for reasons that I personally do not find compelling, or rather I find them to be on shaky grounds. I like physics where models are quite exact, where you have a set of natural laws that allow you to model a system. This, on the other hand, tries to reconcile cognitive dissonance, and in a system where you have several different opinions over several different topics, those opinions are forced, they're projected by a specific type of a matrix. So this is basically the Friedkin-Johnsen model, where the integration of opinions from the network is being attacked by this C matrix that is supposed to model the alignment of whatever you received from the peers with your own internal mental model. So again, the authors try to keep it simple. This is supposed to model the outcome of actual psychological experiments, but I somehow believe that using the linear projection to a null space of a matrix might be too much of a simplification for individuals' internal mental processes. But the idea is, however you take it, that after you receive the opinions from the neighbors in the network, not just that you are modifying them by your individual susceptibility to other people's opinions in contrast to your own, what you're doing is that you are changing them to conform to your mental model. Cognitive dissonance, people don't like to have two ideas in their head that are mutually contradictory, or an idea that contradicts the established values an individual may retain. That creates some psychological anguish, so I'm told. I don't know, but and then people try to sort of reconcile the information that comes from the outside world with what they already think they know. So this is modeling either confirmation biases or whatever internal process one might have to adjust the opinions. At this point, I have to also draw a parallel to what we do in controls. What we like is to have an agent, which is a dynamical system described by a nonlinearity or a linear system. So you would have x equals ax plus the input, and the input comes from the network. So each individual agent has some internal dynamics, which is separate from what comes from the network, and what comes from the network influences that internal dynamics. You could, if you wanted to, if you really had a knack for it, you could try to model the consistent sets of opinions. So we are now talking about opinion sets, a set of opinions on a set of different topics. You could try to model the internal mental process by a dynamic system where the equilibrium points are consistent sets of opinions. So an individual cannot hold any opinion set whatsoever, but only those where his mind can be addressed, to put it bluntly. The interaction from the network would then modify that, move it, skew it, or switch it from one equilibrium point to the next, depending on what it actually is. But if we go down that path, we have to justify that. We have to ask ourselves, why would a nonlinear system that is simple enough for us to analyze in any way be taken as a valid model of someone's internal opinion system in someone's internal mental space? So, and again, you have different possible dynamics, different possible individuals. You would need to estimate the parameters. It's not a parsimonious model. Adding more mathematical complexity to it, though interesting from the analysis point of view, let's add something that we can analyze that offers richer dynamics, might not have basis in actual psychology, in the actual way people think. So those are the two models that I wanted to mention where evolution goes through conventional graphs, graphs that have non-negative edge weights. They are well understood. They have been studied for decades, as we've seen in cooperative control zero. There have been a lot of results in the last 20 years that deal precisely with these types of dynamics where graph edge weights are non-negative numbers. The adjacency matrix is a non-negative matrix. There is a nice mathematical theory behind it. But in 2013, Claudio Altafini, an Italian scientist, engineer, who is now sitting at the University of Linköping, came with a brilliant idea to modify the continuous time consensus algorithms in such a way that they work on graphs that have positive and negative edge weights. So that's a completely different class of systems. It's compelling because in society we can identify individuals that we like and the individuals we dislike. So we maintain protagonistic edges to our friends and antagonistic edges to people who are not our friends. If you imagine that all the edge weights are non-negative, then this sign function goes away and you have a simple continuous time model for single integrator systems that where the time change of a state at a node in a graph is given as a sum over differences of its state and the state of the neighbors. Negative edge modifies that dynamics in a sense that you have minus state of neighbor minus state of agent, so you have basically the sum. There are some conditions on graphs that are usually assumed, and that is if you dislike someone, that person dislikes you back. If you have bidirectional edges and one of them is negative, the other has to be negative. Either both edges are negative or both edges are positive. If you're friends with someone, that person is friends with you. If you dislike someone, that person dislikes you. That's the Diagon sign symmetric condition. I wrote here the real dynamics and complex dynamics. This can be also done for complex numbers as well. Complex edge weight graphs, that leads to something quite interesting. You've noticed something, and I'm certain that you will have a question later. I would be very happy to discuss anything. So, what is the outcome of this class of algorithms? If you have a graph with non-negative edge weights and you run this algorithm, you will have the dynamics described in terms of a Laplacian matrix. The Laplacian matrix of a graph is going to be the system matrix of your continuous time dynamics. So if the graph is strongly connected or contains a spanning tree, the result will be asymptotic consensus. If the graph, again, has all non-negative edges, if there is a spanning tree in the graph as a subgraph, you will have that all of them reach consensus, all of their states end up being the same. That is a space discretized version of a diffusion process. When you have negative edges, the situation is not so clear, but under a crucial condition of structural balance imposed on a graph, what you're going to get is that in terms of dynamical systems, this protocol on a graph, this particular protocol on a graph with signed edges is going to be equivalent in terms of system transformation to the protocol over a graph with unsigned edges. Okay, I feel I may be delving a little too deep into mathematics without offering a proper motivation. In short, what this means is if you have a structural balance in a graph, structural balance is defined as having an even number of negative edges in every loop. That means, as a consequence, that you can partition the graph into two clusters. Within each cluster, everyone is friends. In between clusters, they hate each other. So that's a graph by partition. And if you have structural balance, that is assured. Structural balance also can be simplified, saying that if you have a graph that has structural balance, everyone in the graph subscribes to the notion that a friend of my friend is my friend and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we have this type of consistency, which does not work always in social systems. You have people that maintain friendly relationships, two individuals who hate each other. And individuals, nodes in a graph, they could be groups, they could be societies, they could be cliques, they could be anything. These need not be individuals. These could be wider groups of people that are mutually more interconnected. So if you have the structural balance, if you have that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, then if you change the signs of the states in the dynamical system, this is only a change of sign in the states, you are going to end up having a Laplacian of an unsigned graph, Laplacian of a conventional graph, and the system reaches consensus. So what does it mean if the transformed system reaches consensus? It means that the original system has difference in sign. The outcome of this algorithm under structural balance and strong connectivity or the existence of a spanning tree, structural balance and spanning tree will be enough for you to reach bipartite consensus or permanent dissensus. You will have one cluster, remember, graph is bipartitioned into two clusters that hate each other. One cluster is going to assume a positive value, all the same. The other cluster is going to assume the negative of that. So under structural balance, under this type of consistency of relationships that allows you to partition the graph into two groups that hate each other, the result of this relatively reasonable protocol is going to be that they maintain opposite opinions in steady state. But that all hinges on structural balance. If you remove structural balance, and it is enough in a graph for one offending edge to remove structural balance, you're going to find that the outcome of this protocol is neutral agreement. They are all going to converge to zero. So if you have just one individual, just one node in a graph that maintains friendly relationships to two mutually antagonistic actors, you can imagine that node as being a mediator. He is trying to be friends with two people that hate each other. I'm certain that happened to most of us at some point. Then the entire graph will not be clusterable into two clusters that hate each other, because you will have that one offending agent that is keeping them together. And the result is that the system matrix is going to be asymptotically stable. And forever, whatever the initial distribution of opinions may be, they're not going to diverge into two diametrically opposite values around zero. They're going to come to zero in terms of neutral agreement. Why is this interesting? Because this is a very simple model of opinion polarization on networks. It's in continuous time. You could do it at discrete time as well. Proskurnikov gave it much attention, honestly, and it's not that surprising. But what is interesting is that it's very simple. It's very reasonable model in which social opinion dynamics can progress, and we've seen effects of it on social media. So Facebook, I'm certain that this is more your area. Facebook's business model is to try to keep you on the news feed as much as they can. So they filter content that the algorithm presumes you're going to like. The Facebook connects you with the people that the algorithm decides are most likely up to your liking. That creates an echo chamber, that creates clusterability in a graph, that enforces structural balance. Whereas in societies that function normally in everyday life, you have mediators that break structural balance. And if you reinforce the condition of structural balance in a society, it is going to be much easier for opinions to polarize. Actually, it's going to be, in this simple model, the necessary condition for the opinions to polarize. So the polarizations that we see in social media, polarization of opinions that we see in social media, may be considered as consequences of a reinforced structural balance that are there because of the business models of the companies that maintain those social media. Okay, that was a wild excursion. I originally talked about this in the College of Social Sciences and at the Masaryk University of Brno in 2018 and 2019, where the disinformation campaigns were much more prevalent, so it was quite interesting to look at. But at this point, I will just tell you that these are relatively simple models that are based on graph structural properties that lead to compelling conclusions. Incidentally, the complex case is very, very interesting for people who are doing control of planar formations, because a complex number can parameterize a position in a two-dimensional plane. So it's a similar protocol, except with complex numbers for states. Each node in a network is characterized by a complex number. The outcome of this, with the appropriate condition of structural balance, meaning the condition appropriate for graphs that have complex edge weights, is going to lead to modulus consensus. That's a more general version of signed consensus. So in this case, the states are going to have the same modulus, and they're going to maintain constant differences in phase. That places your planar robots on a circle, and they can surround a target. That being imposed by the structure of complex edges in the network, in the graph. If you have that the condition of structural balance is broken and the graph remains strongly connected, this leads to convergence to zero. So you have asymptotic stability as well. And when these results appeared, I have to say that this was the original work of Altafini in 2013. a good colleague of mine with whom I have some papers related to other topics. Her name is Farnaz. She's sitting at the same hallway with Altafini at University. She extended his results to complex numbers in 2018. So these are rather recent results, and they've started a whole industry of papers where people took all of the results on unsigned graphs and adapted them to graphs that have signed or complex edge weights and satisfy the condition of structural balance. So basically every result that you know on unsigned graphs under the condition of structural balance and protocols that look like this is going to carry over verbatim to bipartite consensus or multi-party consensus. Again, the crucial thing is that in both of these cases, if you have structural balance in a graph, then there exists a state space transformation where you just change the sign or you multiply with a unimodular complex number such that the transformed system looks like conventional consensus algorithm over unsigned graphs that leads to all states being the same. And if the transformed states are the same, then the states that you've multiplied with plus minus 1 or the states that you've multiplied with a unimodular complex number, which is just a change in the phase of a complex number, are going to lead to having just different signs or different phases. So again, these models as models of opinion, primarily Altafini's model attracted a lot of attention. I have to say they have been criticized by Proskurnnikov in a sense that there isn't enough experimental evidence supporting them because of the boomerang effect. So as compelling as this mathematical model of opinion dynamics may be, the question is, why would you be adjusting your opinion based on the opinion of someone you dislike? You are not going to avoid his opinion more because you dislike him. You are more likely not to pay attention to his opinions at all. So this is why people who are more versed in group psychology have criticized the simplicity of Altafini's model in that it need not correspond to reality, simply because it takes influence from people you like and people you dislike through a simple change of sign. That's not how we work. If we dislike someone, we don't just take his opinion with a negative sign and incorporate it as a valid influence as we would the opinion of someone we like. So again, the conclusion is quite compelling in a sense that if you do have structural balance, if you have that two people that dislike each other are consistent in their disliking of everyone else connected in the network, as I've described, that you're going to have polarization. What also offers itself as another side of this conclusion is the possibility, if you already have a polarized society, if you already have a group of people who have separated into two clusters that contain mutually negative, mutually diametrically opposite opinions, by introducing mediators in the network, by breaking structural balance in a specific way, you could bring those two clusters together in a neutral consensus. The position of where to place these mediators is the problem of where to place mediators to expedite convergence to neutral consensus. Remember, if you break structural balance, you end up having all of the states converging to zero, neutral agreement, as opposed to consensus. So those are completely two different dynamical situations. Consensus, everyone agreeing, and permanent dissensus over structurally balanced graphs. Two clusters disagreeing with diametrically opposite opinions, that's the same dynamics. What is different is if you have broken structural balance, then you have asymptotic stability and they come together. So the question is, if you have structural balance, how to break it in such a way to get the society to heal itself as quick as possible. That would actually be an NP-hard problem, which is similar to the problem of introducing leaders in a society in such a way to drive a society in a certain direction. The latter problem is the problem of pinning in pinning control, where you need to identify which nodes in the graph you are going to pin with the leader's information, so that the entire network follows the leader as quickly as possible. That basically means tampering with the diagonal of a matrix and trying to influence its eigenvalues. So in a big matrix, that's a big problem. Okay, for those of you who may be out of the field, matrix eigenvalues are roots of a characteristic polynomial whose coefficients are symmetric functions of matrix elements. So if you change the matrix element, you should change the eigenvalues in a continuous way. But because polynomials of degree greater than 4 do not have a closed form expression for their zeros in terms of their coefficients, you do not have an actual function, Galois group theory. You don't have the actual function, you cannot really express it. So if you are trying, long story short, if you're trying to influence the matrix eigenvalues, which determine the dynamics of the system, by changing specific elements in that matrix, that's the problem. You need to identify which element to change, how to change it, and that is exactly what you're doing if you are choosing which node in a graph to pin by the information from the leader. In a similar vein, if you want to place a mediator, if you want to place an agent with an edges that break structural balance in the network, how will that influence the eigenvalues of now asymptotically stable matrix? You want to place a mediator in such a way that the two opposing camps are brought together as quick as possible. So again, that's really interesting. That's really compelling. I don't know of any results in that direction. I know that when people try to choose the locations for the pinning from a leader, that they did it through simulations. There are some rules of thumb how you do it. You try to pin into two very distant nodes to cut the diameter of a graph in half. You try to connect two hubs, two clusters. You try to influence the already influential nodes, which is whereby the Friedkin centralities and all other centralities come into. You can identify which nodes are influential. So that was really interesting back then, let's say 2018, 2019 timeframe. I know I'm coming with a short delay speaking about these topics. How to introduce mediators in a society that are going to heal the opinion, the community cleavage, that are going to heal the rift in a society in as quick a way as possible. Those could be some non-government organizations or government agencies, public media that people are losing faith into. So, okay, that's those are my thoughts on the topic. There are generalizations of these algorithms when you have time varying graphs or when you have switching graphs, when you have non-linearities that are modeled and massaged such that they would look like a linear algorithm, and those are all complications of the existing models, and they do not really bring anything substantially new. We can discuss these areas if you wish. Having nonlinear functions of opinions that people are looking into may go some way to model how people actually think. So that would be all. And if you have any questions, I wanted to show you these. Sorry, I wanted to show you these simulation results. This used to be a compelling presentation. This is the conventional consensus, by the way. This is how conventional consensus works over non-negative graphs, and this is how the states asymptotically become the same. This is the way you introduce a leader in a sense of pinning control that I've mentioned, that makes your x dot is minus Lx dynamics into delta dot is minus L plus G dynamics. So choosing these pinning gains, how to expedite the convergence of the entire graph to the leader, is actually an NP-hard problem that I've mentioned. I know that I'm repeating myself, but this is the algorithm, the generalization of the above algorithm for the sine graphs. Now you see it in a bit larger and simpler way. And these are taken from the Altafini's paper from 2013, where you have the bipartite consensus with consensus values 1 and -1 by the two clusters, and you have neutral agreement when structural balance is broken, and you have consensus if you have non-negative edge weights. When it comes to complex edge weights that I've also mentioned, that's bipartite. This is multipartite dynamics when you have complex edge weights, and you end up having a coordinated system of agents, coordinated system of individuals. You see here that there are complex edge weights on a graph. What else is here interesting to mention? This is bipartite dynamics when you have internal dynamics of agents. This is the complication that I've mentioned. This is what we like to look at, where we have influence from the network and internal dynamics of the agent. How well that can be appropriated to model the internal mental processes remains an open question, but this class of systems is perfectly well studied, and generalizations of this exist both to sign graphs and complex edge weight graphs. Speaking of structural balance, there are dynamical models of how structural balance is achieved in the network that are kind of self-consistent. And there is an interesting paper by Marvel and Stroges from 2010 that proposes the evolution of graph edge weights in a way that it is nonlinear, and you can have the emergence of a structurally balanced network.
So we have only a few minutes left.
Yes, that's it. Questions? I just wanted to show you nice pictures in this presentation. That was it. This is it. I mostly try to give you, so to summarize, we've seen the French-Harray-deGroot model, Friedkin-Johnsen model on non-negative edge weights, convex combinations of opinions. Statistical analysis is done through simulations in these models, and I wanted to show you the continuous time dynamics. Both of those first ones were in discrete time. Continuous time dynamics on signed edge weight graphs and complex edge weight graphs that leads to opinion polarization without having stubborn individuals, whereas you would have opinion disagreement, opinion differences if you had stubborn individuals before. So, if there are any questions. Yes.
I got the impression when you were talking about stability in the end that you are always considering where to put the one node that will heal the
one or several.
One or several.
Yes.
Okay, that was
yes.
my question. Can it also be like a
minimization
problem where we are looking for the minimum number of nodes to introduce that will heal the network quickly?
If you put it that way, one offending is enough. One node that breaks structural balance is enough. So if you just put one wherever you put it, you're going to have neutral agreement, but that node might be at a position where it takes a long time for it to bring those two clusters together. If you've placed it somewhere at, I don't know, not well connected, then it is going to take a lot of time. So if you can do it with just one, but it might not be the best. If you have more of them, yes, you can do better. You can look at where to position just one of them, how to arrange that multiple of them are positioned throughout the network. Yes, definitely. That's a very good open question.
Okay.
Similarly, in pinning control, when you are adding leader to the network, that's why I placed this so you would see a context in which a leader is included. So your GI is 0 or greater than 0 for all the nodes in the network. You can introduce pinning to the leader not just to one, but to multiple. If the graph is strongly connected, it is enough to pin just one. If the graph has a spanning forest, you need to pin into roots of all trees necessarily to have synchronization to the leader, to have consensus to the leader. You can put multiple versions of the same leader to expedite consensus, yes. And again, the where you will plug them in is a very difficult optimization problem, depending on how many of them you have to spare and where you can put them in the graph.
Any other questions?
I would just like to, yeah. If anyone's interested, by the way, I'm sort of advertising. There is an excellent paper by Friedkin, the author of the Friedkin-Johnsen model from the 90s, and this paper is from 2015. That is really just so beautiful to read. Proskurnikov has more technical papers on the algebraic properties of these matrices that have complex or signed edges. It is not clear. Certain things are not clear. When you don't have structural balance and you don't have strong connectivity, then you have other options. And also what is curious is that IEEE control systems from 2021, I can make this available for you, has a dedicated chapter on opinion dynamics, mostly curated by Proskurnikov, that goes through a variety of models. It's very motivating. It's very compelling. You have really a lot of it, like 50 pages almost of learning hidden influences in large-scale dynamical social networks. Definitely something you may wish to consider. Yes, you had another question.
So you mentioned it's a computationally hard question of where to put the healing nodes.
Yes.
Okay.
I can imagine, because I've never seen it done.
There's no proof for that?
No. I have not seen that done.
There's no complexity proof that deciding where to put the healing node isn't complete?
This is rather a new research field. So
okay.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. Last time I checked, no one answered that question.
Okay.
There are good. I know these are two separate problems. There are good rules of thumb where to place the pinning node. That's kind of simpler because you're picking a node. Here you would need to pick an edge in a graph.
Okay.
That would destroy the property of structural balance. Okay. So if you're interested in that, then I would be very interested as well. Okay. So no, there is no, to my knowledge, there is no complexity proof of where to put it. But again, you are thinking of tampering with an element of an adjacency matrix in a way to influence the eigenvalue of a Laplacian.
Okay.
Same thing, basically. Similar. Here you do the diagonal one. It's even worse because you have a lot of edges to pick in a network, whereas here it's just the diagonal. Can I use this? So when you have, this is simple consensus dynamics where the graph Laplacian determines the dynamics. When you have the leader, then you define the delta, which is xi minus x0. And the delta dynamics, when it doesn't have an index, then it's a vector of all the agent variables, delta 1 to delta n, is going to look like this. Now, if you pin into all the roots of a spanning forest, thank you. If you pin into all the roots of a spanning forest, or if the graph is strongly connected, if you pin into any single one, so just one pinning in is enough, then this is asymptotically stable and delta goes to 0, which is what you want, because then every xi goes to x0. Here, G is a diagonal matrix. So you are adding a non-negative element on a Laplacian's diagonal, trying to get the smallest eigenvalue of L plus G, which is by Pythagorean circle, non-negative real part. You're trying to cleave the smallest real part eigenvalue of this away from 0 as much as possible by tampering with the diagonal. So that's one thing. Another thing is if you're looking at minus L with positive and negative edge weights, which is now asymptotically stable, rather than having, because the Laplacian that's been modified does not satisfy this. It's no longer zero row sum matrix. If you make it in a way with the signed edges as Altafini has done. Because then on a diagonal, you have the sum of moduli of the off-diagonal elements rather than the sum of off-diagonal elements, so the row sums are no longer zero. Anyway, now you are changing basically Lij for j different than I, and you are trying to make the smallest eigenvalue of this, which is non-zero. You're trying to make it as far away from zero as possible. So yeah. Okay. You have more to choose from. Any other questions? Yeah. Internal mental model? Yes. No. Has this been too much mathematics or too quick, or was it okay to follow?
I think it was fine on the amount of mathematics.
Oh,
the talks are very technical. I think it was interesting to hear some connection to some other non-mathematical fields. Okay, because I'm very much interested in the mathematics itself. I just could not gauge how much into math you are. At the College of Social Sciences, I even replaced the derivative. I avoided saying time derivative. I said time change, not to confuse the people. Like the time change of xi here is this. But yeah, it's all about algebraic properties of graph-related matrices that characterize these problems. And when it comes to the complex edge weight graphs, that area is not as researched. So the properties of non-negative matrices, adjacency matrix, and so on, and M matrices, Laplacian matrix, that's been out for decades. Not least the Ziva Chu's great book that has chapters on specific algebraic properties of these matrices. But once you go into signed graphs where the Laplacian is not defined, Laplacian is not defined in a usual way. It's rather defined by having on a diagonal the sum of moduli of the off-diagonal elements. As I told you, authors disagree. If you have structural balance and you have a spanning tree, everything is okay, because then the transformation exists that connects it to the unsigned Laplacian, the Laplacian of a conventional graph. However, if the structural balance is not there, then strong connectivity is required to have some conclusions. Otherwise, you have eigenvectors that belong to zero eigenvalue, which you would not expect in a Laplacian matrix. That is what, in particular, Proskurnikoff writes in his 2014 CDC paper, which I can also gladly make available for all of you. Again, lot of open areas there. What I'm interested in is mostly motivated by robotics and dynamics. So we have graphs that have edge weights, which are non-negative real numbers, positive and negative, complex numbers. I want to look into quaternions. There are results, speaking of quaternion consensus verbatim with the appropriate structural balance condition is going to lead to permanent dissensus in quaternion phases. That's cool if you're looking at positions and orientations of rigid bodies like unmanned aerial vehicles, for instance. I have to tell you, if you like algebra, that there have been papers from 2014 that look into graphs that have edge weights from finite fields. So you have modular dynamical systems, and fascinating thing is, I was very much interested in that. I wanted to develop that, but I realized that Francesco Bullo, one of the great ones in my field, had done that 2 years before I ever got the idea. But it's not as useful.
That's another area completely unconnected with social dynamics. So I'm sorry I'm jumping from topic to topic, but these are finite state automata interconnected on a graph that have to synchronize. And conditions on graph topology are much stronger. Graph needs almost to be completely connected for you to have consensus over Galois fields. So the question is, how does the algebraic structure in which your nodes have a state determine the sparsity of a graph that your algorithm can be distributed on and reach consensus? So if you have finite fields, if you have very, very little structure in the states of a single agent, you need to have almost a complete graph. If you have real numbers or complex numbers, it can be quite sparse. So where's the transition? It's kind of difficult to move from finite fields to continua fields. It's completely two different worlds. I know discrete mathematics and continuous mathematics. I live in continuous realm. I was trying to find someone for discrete stuff for a very long time. Yeah, it was difficult. I found a person and we realized that the easy results have been done. The difficult results, which are proven to be NP hard, which is how to structure your graph with edge weights in Galois field, that's unsolved, and Francesco Bullo left it for future work because, of course, it's very difficult. It becomes, in discrete dynamics, a combinatorial problem of how to find all the graphs over a specific field that will guarantee consensus. But that's a topic for a completely different seminar that has nothing to do with opinion dynamics or polarization, because no one would model people as a finite state automaton. I hope at least not. Nobody would model people as a finite state automaton. But just so that you know, finite state automaton, yes or no, 1 and 0. I don't know how it would work in Boolean terms. But just so that you know that theory of linear modular systems is well developed and applied to these consensus algorithms on graphs. They have to be in discrete time necessarily because of the discrete topology of the finite vector space. And yes, and the graph has to be almost completely connected, or a complete graph rather than a sparse graph. But yeah, anyway.
So we have used all time actually to conclude the talk.
Thank you.
So let's thank the speaker again.
It was a pleasure.